Hello, this will be a demonstration of proposition 14 from book 8 of Euclid's Elements, which says that if a square number measure a square number, its side will measure its side, but if on the other hand, on the converse, we're given that the side measures the side, then the square number shall measure the square number. You should notice right off the bat that this is a proposition where we have two different givens, and thus two different things to prove, or two different specifications. This isn't unusual by now. We've seen this all the way since proposition 3.14, but it is important to note that there will be two different scenarios, two different cases, as it were, in this proposition that we'll have to deal with accordingly. But regardless, we are given some constants, namely the number a and the number b. These will be two square numbers. We're also given their sides, c and d. So that c squared, that is c times c, makes a, and d squared, that is d times d, makes b. But what will differ between the two cases is this part of the given. We are either given that the square number a measures the square number b, or that the side c measures the side d. If first we're given that the square number a measures the square number b, then the side c will measure the side d. But if on the other hand, on the converse, we're given that the side c measures the side d, then we want to prove that the number a measures the number b. But before even launching into either of those two cases, we're going to create the number e. The number e will be the product of c and d. So c times d makes the number e. That number being constructed, let's deal with the first case, where the number a measures the number b. The first thing Euclid notes is that the three numbers a, e, and b form a continued proportion. This is something we've seen a few times by now, all the way since proposition 8.2, but more recently in propositions 8.11 and 8.12, most pertinent of which I think is 8.11, because this is where we have two square numbers. Euclid arrives at this by a couple uses of proposition 7.17. We've seen this a few times by now, which is why he doesn't rehash it. I won't rehash it either, but if it is still foggy or unclear to you how exactly we get continued proportions like this, it was certainly foggy to me by the time I got here. Refer back to those previous propositions, 8.2, 8.11, and 8.12, or my previous videos on them. That being said, we're just going to take it that the three numbers a, e, and b form a continued proportion, so that a is to e just as e is to b. But we also know that the first number a measures the last number b, which then means we can say by proposition 8.7, which says that if any number of numbers be in continued proportion and the first measure the last, the first will also measure the second. So here we are given a continued proportion of a, e, and b, and the first number a measures the last number b, which then means we can say that the first number a measures the second number e, so a measures e. Next, we note that the number c has been multiplied by two numbers c and d to make two other numbers, two products, a and e, right? Because c times c, or that is c squared, makes the number a, and c times d makes the number e. That was done in our first step, which means we can say also by proposition 7.17 that the two numbers which are multiplied have the same ratio as their products, so that c is to d just as a is to b. But you'll remember that we just proved that the number a measures the number e, which then means we can say by the definition of proportionality, definition 7.20, that because a measures e, c also measures d. And this is what we wanted to prove. Given that the number a measures the number b, we wanted to prove that the number c measures the number d. And we've just done that, which means we're done with our first case. But if on the other hand, we're given that the number c measures the number d, what we want to prove is that the number a measures the number b. This we do in similar sort of steps, but this time we begin by noting the proportion in the previous step. Because the number c has been multiplied by the two numbers c and d to make the two products a and e, we can say by proposition 7.17 that c is to d just as a is to e. But this time, we were given that c measures d, which means again by the definition of proportionality, we can therefore conclude that a measures e. Next, we say that the three numbers a, e, and b form a continued proportion. This again is just like step 2, and the logic of it is just a couple uses of 7.17 that we've seen a few times by now, most importantly in proposition 8.11. So Euclid doesn't rehash that logic. I'm not going to rehash it either. The point is that A, E, and B form a continued proportion, such that A is to E just as E is to B. But you'll remember we just proved that A measures E. So we can then say, again by the definition of proportionality, definition 7.20, that E has to measure B. So we see that A measures E and E measures B, which then means by a property of numbers that the number A has to measure the number B. This is quite simple. 3 measures 6, 6 measures 12, therefore 3 measures 12. This is a valid conclusion to make. So that because A measures E, E measures B, A therefore has to measure B by a property of numbers. And this is what we wanted to prove. Given that C measures D, we wanted to prove that their squares measure so that A measures B. And we've just done that, which means we're done with the proposition, therefore, etc. Q, E, D. I'm going to give an example with particular numbers. So say we have two square numbers, 4 and 16. 4 obviously measures 16. What this proposition allows us to say is that the side of the square 4 measures the side of the square 16. The side of 4 is 2, and the side of 16 is 4. So 2 measures 4. That's easy to verify. Again, the language of side is about square roots. That's what we would say nowadays. 2 is the square root of 4, and 4 is the square root of 16. On the converse, if we're given that 2 measures 4, we know that the square on 2 measures the square on 4. So 2 squared measures 4 squared. 2 squared is obviously 4. 4 squared is obviously 16, so 4 measures 16. Again, we can verify that this proposition holds. Before the video ends, however, I do want to take a brief moment to talk about the language of square number, where exactly that comes from, and what's the deal with calling the square root of a number its side? Like, why exactly do we do that? Most people sort of just take the language of square number as given, at least that's how I was taught, but there is a geometric intuition behind it. If we have a line, and we'll say that this line is 4 long, doesn't really matter the units here, just this line is 4. What doing 4 squared means is literally building a square on this line. And we know that if we build a square on this line, squares are obviously equilateral, we know that. So the side here is also going to be 4. And what's the area of this square? Well, it's just 4 times 4, which is 16. So this is where we get the language of square numbers from. You can take a number, represent it as a line, and then build a square on that, and then whatever the area of that square is, that number will be the square of your side. This also helps us recognize why Euclid calls square root sides. Not simply because square root is just kind of a weird term to come up with, but there is also a geometric intuition behind it. If we have a square with area 16, then its side has to be 4, or its square root has to be 4. Now, from this explanation, you might already be able to understand why Euclid calls cube numbers cubes, why he calls products of 2 numbers planes, and why he calls products of 3 numbers solids. I won't get into that right now because that hasn't come up yet, but they will come up in the next proposition, 8.15. So because this is all I have to say about proposition 8.14, I'll end the video here and move on to that proposition 8.15.